You got on all these layers.
All right.
All right, with Bob LaSalle's permission, I'm going to call the Monday, June 25th, 2018 or 1918, whichever time zone you want to be in, of the Oregon City Planning Commission. We are having a work session tonight with the Transportation Advisory Committee, who are members are sitting to my right and to my left. We will be having a discussion regarding Transportation Planning Analysis 101. Have you guys seen this before? Because I believe we have.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm gonna make it much more in-depth with my questions.
There was a presentation in the past year
Yes, that's
to
what I
both
thought.
Planning Commission and TAC. We did a brief.
Okay.
Okay, well, to my left is Planning Commissioner Bob Mahoney, TAC member Mike Mitchell. To my right is Planning Commissioner Mr. Tom Guile, also Mr. Damon Mabey. TAC member Chair, are you still the chair? Are you still the chair?
Yes, I am.
Bob LaSalle, then Planning Commissioner Mr. Vern Johnson, and Planning Commission and TAC member John Anderson.
Scandinavian section over here.
That's right, well, I should be over there then too, since I'm 12%, so according to Ancestry.com. All right, John, well, does anybody have any questions before we turn this meeting over to John about what we're going to talk about, or maybe why we're here, why you're here? Because sometimes us having so many meetings, we don't know which meeting we're at sometimes. All right, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Denise. I'm John Ripplinger, and I've been serving in a capacity of consulting transportation engineer and development review engineer for the city for about 20 years. In fact, I've seen some of you grow into your positions and move onward and upward. Some of the city council members were, of course, past members of the TAC or the Planning Commission and so forth. I gave a presentation to your predecessors. Some of you are the same, but in April 2016, I gave kind of a similar presentation, and I have some of the information is kind of similar to that, but I think a little bit different twist on it. I can spend more time than you are willing to sit, but we'll give it a start. Aim for an hour and a half or two, and I'd be happy to have you ask me questions as I'm going along, and I hope that with my preparation, I'll be able to say, I'd like to discuss that in a couple slides from now. But hey, let's give it a try, and please interrupt me and ask questions as we go along. Let's see, so technology, is this supposed to?
It's the same thing that's happening to the computer.
Start that way, huh?
That's what this
Are there
meeting is all
batteries?
about, is do our computers.
Okay. Okay, good. So, as I said, I gave it about 2 years ago. So let's start with the question of when are transportation analyses performed. I've identified 7 different times here when there is some transportation analysis. First is with the regional transportation plan. Metro runs that, and about every 5 or 7 or 10 years, they go through a major update trying to keep the transportation plan current and matching the regional land use plan, pushing that planning horizon out to 2035 or 2040. The second phase is, or second stage, is with the transportation system plan, city or county plan. City and county transportation system plans, or TSPs, are mandated under state law. And again, we try to keep those pushed out to about a 20 or 25-year planning horizon. They need to be kept consistent with the regional transportation plan. But they serve a smaller geographic area. They're more refined in certain areas and go into a lot more detail.
Can I just add one thing to those plans too? When we do those plans, we take our zoning designation and run through all these complicated models, and we assume full build out of the city based on the zoning designation at the time. So it doesn't look at the transportation impact on the day they do the analysis. It takes a look at what if the city were to build out fully by 2035 or whatever that is. So then when they run the models, we run as if we've been in full build out, but then also the metro region does too, because we know that transportation comes in and out of Oregon City.
Another time when we undertake transportation analyses are with sub-area plans. Park Place concept plan would be one example. The South End concept plan would be another. Those are, again, a more focused geographical area, but they're built upon the basically similar assumptions to that's in the TSP. We always have transportation analyses done when there is a rezoning proposal. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Fifth occasion is with development applications. You're familiar with, the requirement that an applicant come forward and analyze the transportation conditions associated with a subdivision or a new office building or revamping, expanding a shopping center or simply putting in a store. Master plans are yet another. They're kind of a variation on the development application because it's a phased development application where the applicant has the ability to say that he is going to come forward with 2 or 3 or more phases of development at 3 years, 6 years, and 10 years, giving him and the city a little bit more specificity and allowing for phased implementation of his project and phased implementation of the infrastructure, providing a bit of certainty for both the applicant and the city. And the final time or I would say another time we go through transportation analyses are with road projects. The Myers Road concept plan having been completed a few years ago was another example of that. We're looking rather than so much at the impact of land development. What we're doing is we're very specifically designing the infrastructure to match the predicted traffic volumes. So 7 times when we undertake transportation analyses.
Quick question. So as you make a transition from a concept plan to a master plan, and you finally get that agreement between the city and the developer, do you actually have a formal development agreement, which is a contract that says the city's going to do these 10 things, the developer's going to do these 15 things?
Yes, I think that's a lot of it.
They actually have a signed contract and agreement.
It's the conditions of approval that are specified for each phase of the development.
It sounds like you're talking about a development agreement.
Yes.
And what John's saying is when they come in for their master plan, we have expectations of what the roadways will look like identified, and we say this is what the road will be. Most master plans don't have that agreement there. It's only when there's like the city is a part of it. So in general, the answer is no. We just say, you're building a collector road, here's what a collector road looks like. You're building a local road, here's what the local road looks like. You can go off later and ask for SDC credits and things like that, but you build what the code says you will build because we, as a city, agreed that's what it is.
What if the collector street is outside of the master plan? The master plan is going to depend on the collector road for just that, to collect traffic volume out of the master plan.
Well, it depends on where it is geographically with respect to the area. If it's adjoining or through the property, the collector road would need to be built. in connection with the particular phase of development. Or as Laura was saying, the developer might have to actually build it and then be reimbursed for portions of it. The other possibility is that the developer will contribute to the construction of it, and the city will end up executing it or parts of it. An example with the master plan would be for the Clackamas Community College. I think I've forgotten the exact dates of it, but their original master plan was in, what, 2001 or something like that. And with the first phase of development, we determined that the existing infrastructure was basically able to accommodate that. But for the second, much larger phase, there would be a requirement that a improved access would be provided from the highway, the Highway 213 side of it, either at Malala or at Myers Road. And in fact, it's the Myers Road part that was selected as the solution for it. So the college was obligated through the conditions of approval to, in essence, build some of that local road access, to donate right-of-way, and it all gets very complicated. But in fact, the city undertook the concept plan for Myers Road, and the college was a participant, and the college is fulfilling its obligations as the implementation of it gets closer. So that's an example where it was part of a master plan with a refinement study to specify exactly the road consistent with the transportation system plan. Okay? Plans, just briefly here, I want to draw your attention to 4 different plans going from the largest geographical area to the smaller ones. The Oregon Highway Plan, we need to pay particular attention to that in Oregon City because we have so many major highways under state jurisdiction. The Regional Transportation Plan, we use that for certain things, among others. Oregon City is part of a regional center. We have the Oregon City Transportation System Plan. The most recent one was adopted in 2013. It's been modified, amended a couple times. And we're moving forward, I think, with further amendments to it. The Clackamas County Transportation System Plan also affects some of our system because the county is an important participant and still the owner of some of the roadways. It's important to keep in mind, though I sometimes have trouble keeping track, the fact that transportation is so important, but transportation is simply one of the elements and it's part of the system that serves the land uses and economic and all of the other statewide and regional and citywide goals relating to development, economics, preservation of open space, the preservation of farmland, urban growth boundary, everything is all wrapped in together, but transportation is an important factor in serving those uses, and there are a lot of trade-offs made in every section between every one of those elements. So studies. Now I talked about plans. Now I want to talk a little bit about studies. Again, we have a couple different categories. We have the special studies and corridor studies, and I've given a couple examples there. Myers Road Corridor Plan, the Holcomb Boulevard Pedestrian Enhancement Plan, Alternative Mobility Study for 213. I guess another one, South End Plan. There are just many, many of them. And those are generally undertaken by the city or some combination of public agencies to achieve a particular goal, and more refinement and better defining what is included in the larger plans like the TSP and the Metro plan. Then we have the other category are the development-driven studies. This is where we require the developer to analyze the impacts of his proposed development so we can make sure that he is contributing his share to the solutions that are needed that have been laid out in more general terms within the Regional Transportation Plan and the City TSP. We have three different categories of those. We have the Transportation Impact Study with a TPR analysis when it's required for zone change, and a transportation analysis letter. And going to get into trying to explain those for you. Damon?
Okay, so you're gonna go more in depth than like a TIS?
Yep.
Okay, I'll wait.
And here we go. Here's another part of trying to put these in perspective for you. So I've listed 5 types of studies or plans across the top with some of the attributes down on the left side. So you can kind of see where we're refining and we're giving up some things and getting others as we move down. So the RTP is regional, long-range time frame. It does require an analysis to show whether it's complying with the state's transportation planning rule, OAR 660 Division 12, which you can suffer through. I said, does it, okay, then basic intersection operational analysis. And the answer pretty much is no, they don't go into that with the RTP. Don't go to a detailed one. And the basis for analyzing this are the regional totals. Metro does an enormous job of analyzing what the employment situation is going to be, what the number of dwelling units is, how it's all going to fit within the urban growth boundary, coordinating among 30 different public agencies. How is this going to be distributed? And we all know about that, UGB expansion proposals and all of that, done on a regional basis. And it's a laborious, careful, calculated process. The city TSP, as I mentioned, is a refinement. It must be consistent with the RTP. It's got pretty much also a long-range orientation. It must have a section that shows how it is complying with the transportation planning rule. There are some basic intersection operational analyses performed for the TSP. In our 2013 one for Oregon City, there were 21 intersections that were analyzed in some detail. Now, 21 is not a lot, but we selected the ones that we felt we needed some work on.
John, on these concept plans, does Metro go into detail to the point where they look at it and say, well, if it was totally built out, it doesn't comply with our regional transportation plan. It doesn't coordinate with it.
Well, I think that's I think it's kind of the reverse order, that the regional land use plan and all of the assumptions with regard to population and employment and densities are used to determine what is going to be needed in the transportation arena. And part of the solution for the transportation program is, it's really a 3 or 4 pronged approach. Part of it are physical infrastructure projects, a lot more emphasis on alternative modes, alternatives to single occupancy vehicles. There's an emphasis on regional centers to try and keep trips shorter. A lot more emphasis on people changing their mode of travel, their time of travel, and frankly, a recognition that there will be more congestion.
That's a given?
That's a given. And I've got a couple on one of my upcoming slides, I got some numbers out of the city TSP to help you understand, or just, give you a flavor for some of that.
And that's because of this balance between preservation of farmland and UGB and economic development is regional goals.
Yep.
Might be a good idea for all of us to have a copy of this chart, just as a reference.
Yeah, we can send you the presentation.
Sure.
Cool.
Great.
So as going down that TSP column, again, there are some, yeah, Damon.
Go back to the metro one.
Yeah.
So they don't do any basic intersection operational analysis?
Not really. They set corridor. They analyze things by corridors.
Because here's what I'm curious about. They pushed the UGB back, and Redland and Upper Holcomb Road develop. They don't look at the Redland, Abernathy, Holcomb Road intersection?
I don't think so.
It's just our problem and we have to deal with it, even though they're the ones that dumped 10,000 cars on the road upstream of it?
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily they who did that.
Well, I mean, if they move the urban growth boundary, then that
Well-
allows development. It's in the county.
I think there needed to be a local proponent for adding that to the UGB. So, more often than not, I think the negotiation about UGB expansion is coming from a dozen cities that are all wanting the UGB expanded in their community. And there's really only justification for half that many, or half the size.
X amount, whatever. it is.
Right. So I think that there must have been, like with the Park Place area. So that was a 2001 plan. I wasn't involved, and I'm not exactly sure when the Park Place area was brought into the UGB, but it was a long, long time ago.
Brought into the city in the 90s, and I know one of the things that got asked quite a bit, even though it was an emergency health hazard annexation, what got asked several times during the process when I was staff was, what is the transportation impact going to be? And they were told, because this is a health hazard annexation, that is irrelevant. But
Okay.
it was still a valid question to be asked.
Right, okay. Well, thank you for that history.
A quick question?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Oh, so, are cities by the state law required to include urban growth boundary to accommodate 20 years worth of growth, assuming they have the land? So if you're Gladstone, you're completely sounded, you may not have the land, but you got Happy Valley and, Happy Valley, and you've got Oregon City that can expand. So we're mandated to expand, right? Even if everyone in the city wanted to
So
not expand.
here's the short story, sort of short. So we have 3 concept plan areas. They included UGB expansions over a whole variety of times. It's not like, Park Place, Beaver Creek alone had a variety of expansion areas. A lot of them were original UGB expansion areas. So back then when we did it, they expanded the UGB and they said, city, do a concept plan to make sure that you could serve it with transportation and that'll help you identify your comprehensive plan designations and make sure, you serve, you protect your Goal 5 resources, your historic and environmental and things like that. So we did that. Nowadays, jurisdictions raise their hand and say, hey, please expand the UGB near me. And this just happened, it just ended in June or January of this year. Each jurisdiction had to throw their hat in the ring. So then it gives each of those jurisdictions a timeline to then create their concept plan before the UGB gets expanded. And so they each then go through a concept planning process. And then at the end of it, they all put their hats in the ring and they go before Metro Council. And Metro Council decides, does the UGB need to be expanded? If so, how much and which one of these jurisdictions wins? There's criteria for all of this. We did not raise our hand and say expand our UGB this year. So nowadays you do a concept plan first. That does have a lot of collaboration with the local jurisdiction. So it's a little bit different now. If you didn't, the city has to put in a fair amount of resources to complete those concept plans. They're very time consuming. In our history, some of them were difficult to adopt. It took us, 10 years from start to finish with Beaver Creek, and we're still not done. So, because of courts, it can be very expensive and challenging. So, because of that, there is for efficiency's sake, there's normally a desire to bring in larger tracts of land. We just have little bits and pieces around our UGB at the moment.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I necessarily got my question answered. If Molalla wants to build out and they've got urban land versus rural reserves and they dump 2,000, 4,000 more houses and they're all trying to get to Portland, they're coming up 213. How far do they have to, if Metro isn't looking at intersections and the state's not looking at intersections, then we're just dealing with what happens at our intersections.
Well, I think they do not look at intersections, but I think they look at corridors. That's the distinction I'm trying to provide here.
But we look at intersections with our TSP, which uses the same data, which uses the regional data that shows everybody developing.
But if we say Molalla is going to crash 213 in Beaver Creek and it's going to fail,
well, I think
can we stop Mollalla's building?
Presumably, this matrix of factors used by Metro takes into consideration the regional implications of this. And I think they go, I'm not an expert in this,
okay,
but I think that they go through trying to analyze the various things like water and sewer. What are the implications for that? How expensive is it going to be to provide those urban level of services in connection with this particular UGB expansion, and what will be the implications on the regional transportation network? So I think that there would be some recognition of that.
But certainly, when we do our transportation system plan, we put it into the model, and the model includes full build out of the region as a whole. And so we would see places where there is failure of our intersection, whether we caused it or not. And that's the problem with a lot of Oregon City is we may not cause it.
And
We get quite a bit of through traffic that has significant impacts on our system. And yeah, that's just the reality of it. Of course, for what it's worth, every community thinks that they're suffering from that, which I guess is part of the rationale for having a regional transportation plan and a regional government.
right, it's just a lot of the places that think that aren't necessarily topologically constrained.
Yep.
So.
Yep.
Topographically.
So.
If you don't
So,
mind, one more quick
Yeah.
question, trying to clarify that. So if that traffic from Molalla, just say was coming in on Beaver Creek, which is a county road, not a state highway, right? Or
Yes.
is it city now in the city?
It's,
At the half of
Both.
Beaver Creek on the other side of 213 is in the
Oh, yeah,
county,
yeah, I'm
and our
talking
half
about the
is.
east side of
Highway
213. So if the regional study, the corridor study said that 70% of the traffic was non-Oregon City traffic, would that mean that the region is responsible for 70% of the cost of upgrading and get that corridor? Or do they put it on the individual city?
Well, it's a negotiation, and one hopes that one has,
Some leverage, huh?
hope you have leverage, hope you have willing partners, hope
Yeah.
that there's money available to try to work together to solve some things.
But
Thank
at
you.
the end of the day, John, whose obligation is it to solve the long-term viability of that intersection to make sure it complies with mobility standards?
Well, it's probably the jurisdiction within which it falls. I mean, ultimately, you know, with Oregon City, with intersections within Oregon City, if most of the people who are being inconvenienced or affected by the facility are Oregon City residents, you're kind of the leadership of the organization, and you try to solve that. You enlist us as staff to help you with the arguments at JPAC or Metro Council or, you know, whatever.
ODOT or wherever, yeah.
Yeah,
Oregon Transportation Commission.
Yep.
I think the problem is that the solutions are normally so expensive. I mean, we're not talking about, at this point, when we get to that place, we're not talking about low-hanging fruit. I mean, building new lanes, taking up land is expensive.
Yep.
Just putting in lights.
I mean, what was the fix for the grade separated intersection and various forms of that for Beaver Creek in 2013 was over $50 million.
Although, to be fair, talking with the ODOT people, they were talking about having 213 be the flyover. So if that's the math they were using for their 50 million, I got an issue with that number. But it's still a number to shoot for before, if you're gonna work it at putting it together. You shoot at 50, you hope you build it at 50, but yeah, I mean.
I do have a couple slides of Beaver Creek 213 that if we get to them, we'll get to them and can talk about it a little bit more. Continuing down the basis for development citywide totals, we have Laura mentioned the use of the regional transportation planning model, transportation analysis zones. There are probably around 70 of them in Oregon City, and several thousand of them within the region, each of which has numbers associated with it for households, employment of different categories, and various other factors that are used. But we do look at Oregon City totals. The city staff is approached by Metro and asked for advice and guidance on the assumptions for each of those transportation analysis zones. Moving to the third column, transportation impact study with a zone change. The geographical area is smaller. We have specified in our guidelines for transportation analyses, which is referenced in city code, says that the applicant, the developer, has to look at things that are impacted by intersections that have 20 or more peak hour trips. The planning horizon year, now this is important, the planning horizon year, when there's a zone change, means that the applicant has to analyze the TSP future planning horizon year as well as his projected development build-out. So he's looking at 2 or 3 years and 15 or 20 years out. Does 2 different analyses when there's a zone change involved. It requires a TPR analysis. TPR is the state law that governs the long-range transportation planning. The applicant does not only a basic intersection operation analysis, but a detailed intersection operation analysis. And the development is the specific land uses that are proposed by the developer for his property. Usually we're talking about dwelling units or the buildings by different land use categories, retail, commercial, a school, a church, whatever. Moving to the fourth column, a transportation impact study, if it is an outright permitted use, they still have to do the analysis where they have more than 20 peak hour trips, but they don't have to do a transportation planning rule analysis because they are consistent with the TSP and what was assumed for that land. They do have to do the detailed operational analysis, but it's really close to the development. If you get a 30 or 40 lot subdivision, it may only be one intersection they have to look at. The bigger the development, the further they have to move out. The transportation analysis letter is for small developments, for 24 or fewer peak hour trips. So we're talking about small little subdivisions. We're talking about small office building, some pretty inconsequential things. The focus there is on just the development build-out year. They don't have to do any particular analysis, not even any transportation operations analysis. So this is the overview. I guess I probably could have gone through this a little bit more quickly, because now I'm going to go into the details and end up repeating some of what I just said in trying to discuss this. I thought we'll try graphics and see if that helps. So I've got those 5 different types of studies, and trying to show this is a geographic a chart, a graph of geographic area and duration. So again, going from large down to small, I've got the RTP, the Transportation System Plan. The TIAs with zone change are usually, they're a lot smaller, but here I'm showing you that they do the short-term and the long-term analysis. The TIA for the allowed use is only a short-term analysis. And the transportation analysis letter for the really small development is short-term. Usually those are a single 1 year of construction. So it's a really short term, and the amount of analysis they have to do is even less. Then trying to show you the area, the geographical area, and the level of analysis that's required. The RTP, as I said, does a lot of corridor level analysis, but it's a very large area. The TSP, we're covering a smaller area, but a bit more detail. The transportation impact study with a zone change or for an allowed use, there's a lot more detail, but for a smaller area. So now we're going to get to a little bit about the transportation system plan. Again, I said on several of those things, we don't have to do a TPR analysis. We don't have to do a lot of detailed analysis because we assume they are consistent with the transportation system plan. The transportation system plan looks at our overall citywide needs and solutions. So let's take a look and review what assumptions we made when in 2013, we adopted a new TSP covering our expected growth through 2035. This is right out of the TSP, and it shows that we're expecting to go from 13,000 to 21,000 households. We've identified 3 different general broad areas of employment. We've got retail, service, and other employees, adding 2,000 to 3,000 in each of those 3 broad categories, adding a total of over 8,000 employees over the next, this 25-year period. I think it's also good to take a look and say, okay, that's 25 years, and we're adding 8,000 employees. That's about 8,000 households, that's about 300 a year for an average year. Now, we know from, we're gonna have fluctuation in that. Some years were, 2008, 2010, we didn't have any. But, that's kind of a 300 a year in the household area and about 300 a year in the employment area. So,
But with all the industrial land in the Beaver Creek area, is 3,300 a legitimate number for other?
well, you gotta remember, other is gonna include lots of things. That's gonna include, government, it's gonna include school, it's gonna include the,
Right, and that's what I'm
Yeah.
saying, I think 3,300 isn't even enough for the industrial, much less and the rest. I mean, we can't forget the Professor and Mary Ann.
yep.
So, I don't know, I'm just,
I think it's probably fair to say that this is a balancing act that Metro has to go through. That every city in the region probably thinks they are the most attractive for adding employment. And they all think that they're gonna get a bit more than their share.
well,
So-
I understand that, I'm just saying, we have a defined amount of industrial acreage.
Yes,
Is there some sort of formula that says you get 96.3 employees per industrial acre? Or how do you come up with a number like this?
well, they're looking, okay, Metro looks at expected employment growth by sector across the entire metro region, which is based on, then state forecasts and national forecasts. So they are, I think, trying to guess and to allocate how much is happening within each region, and then how that will end up being distributed. Now, they do make different assumptions that industrial employment has far fewer employees per acre than would retail or government service. So the industrial sector ends up taking rather a lot of land for the number of employees, particularly as we move to a more robotic-oriented industrial sector.
Okay, because I'm thinking about, one of my security jobs is in an industrial facility, and they've got 3,000 employees.
Okay?
And it's one building, that's, I don't know, 150,000 square feet, I don't know what that becomes an acreage, but the parking lot and everything. But, and that's why I was wondering, is there some sort of formula that says industrial is X per acre and service is X per acre?
Well, there are a lot of statistics on it, Damon, and I can tell you that in terms of industrial, the number of employees per acre is usually in the 2 to 3. 2 to 3 per acre of parcel size. So that's pretty small.
Okay,
Yeah.
Because I look at potentially a third of what's in the Park Place concept plan being industrial.
Right.
And trying to, acclimate that to, how many people is that in others,
Yeah. Well, and then we have examples, a lot of the server farms. Huge acreage, and,
Yeah, like 20
Prineville and whatever, for like 3 people.
Well, I'm saying
But-
20 people total because of all the
Right.
shifts.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. So, lots of acreage, in that particular case, lots of energy draw, but no transportation impact.
And when we participate in the buildable lands inventory, which helps inform studies like this, it does remove environmentally sensitive areas. We do have a lot of off-limit areas too, and so the model is very sensitive to that.
Bob?
Well, I think that since this graph is right out of the TSP, if you went back and looked at the details of when the TSP was put together, there might be some explanations of how they came across or how they came about these numbers within the TSP itself, rather than relying on you as a transportation planner to give us answers to those kind of questions a little bit.
Yeah.
But it magically disappeared.
Again, back to the TSP, some of the maps that are in there. This is the one that shows the households. Now, the most intense yellow-orange are the transportation analysis zones where they're expected to be more than 300 new households, more than 300 new dwelling units added. So we do have a dispersion of these, and you can see they're part of the South End concept plan area, and the Beaver Creek area, and the Park Place area are the areas that are assumed to be more intensely developed by taking the underutilized vacant acreage and turning it into dwelling units. There are three maps of the, went one too far. Here's the retail. Again, we've got over 300 in the most intense area, but we'll look at the number of zones that have the 50 to 150 employees in the retail sector. Here's the service employment. Of course, that includes all of the restaurants and coffee shops and things like that, as well as just a whole variety of different services that are provided. And here's the map of other employment. Now, some of this would include the industrial, and some of it, as I said, is government, schools, things like that. So TSP, going back to that again, we've got 8,000 new households. We've got more than 8,000 in the employment, and the expected increase in PM peak hour trips is over 21,000 PM peak hour trips generated in Oregon City.
John?
Yeah.
What's today's number?
Probably in the 40,000.
So we're looking at
probably about between 35 and 37,000.
So we're looking at more than a 50%
yes,
increase in peak hour trips.
Right.
Okay.
And some of the outcomes, and again, these numbers come out of the TSP. The per capita, as per person, PM peak hour vehicle miles of travel is expected to decline from about 2.9 to 2.6. That decline is the change of mode, more bicycling and walking, more public transit, more shared ride, whether you call it carpooling or just shared ride stuff. And some of it has to do with a shift to non-peak hour travel. But that's pretty significant. You got more than 10% reduction in per capita travel. Now we're adding 60% more people. But part of the solution is a reduction in the per capita travel. We're also, again from the TSP, PM peak hour per person delay. Now, we can get into a big discussion about delay, but it's going to increase from 2.2 minutes of delay per person to something more like 3 3 to 3.2. The 3.2 would be the trend if we didn't do some road capacity improvements and transit improvements, and, so the goal is to keep that delay to less than 3 minutes, but still, it's a substantial increase over what we're seeing today. Mike?
On both those miles of travel and the delay, that if part of my commute is outside of the city limits, those two numbers are only what's happening to me inside the city limits?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is some of the stuff that's in the outcomes section of the TSP. So again, the whole idea is we're having to make some compromises and sacrifices because, as Laura said, there's expense of building new stuff. There's the farmland and forest, and there's the, historic preservation and the livability of the neighborhoods, just everything going into this says that the old 1950s solution of just build it bigger is not part of the solution in moving from 2010 to 2035. So.
Hey, John, you have other clients for other cities. So can you talk about how we compare to other cities? So are we doom and gloom and everybody else is doing good, or how do we compare?
I would say that it's comparable. I think a lot of cities are doing, first of all, every city is recognizing that they can't build their way out. Every city is accepting more delay. The smaller the city, the more surprised they are and the more resistant they are to accepting more congestion. And one of my past clients was City of Ontario, and essentially they thought it was horrendous congestion if the light wasn't green when they got to the intersection. It was said, we've got a 4-lane road going underneath the railroad tracks, and it's currently carrying 16,000 vehicles a day, and you're telling us it's going to be 24,000. Say, where else in the world is there a state highway going under an underpass carrying 24,000 vehicles a day? I say, well, let's see. Powell Boulevard, US 26 at 17th goes under an underpass right before it gets to the Ross Island Bridge. Now, it's got 47,000 vehicles a day.
No, I think you're talking about it going the other direction, going towards, there isn't a railroad underpass, but it's going east.
Well,
It drops
Powell.
Underneath the 17th crossover.
Yeah.
yeah,
Where the-
so,
Yeah.
but, right there.
I've seen that at Gridlock, that was very exciting.
So, it's all perspective. Some others, we think, oh, we ought to take a field trip, put everybody in the bus and give them the rental cars when they get to Portland at, 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon and let them experience some real congestion. So I think every city is struggling with this. And part of it is the recognition that, the state isn't helping as much. A lot of the small cities, their big concern is the operations at the ramp terminals for their one interchange or their two interchanges. City of Sandy with Highway 26, serving as their main street, impacted by ski traffic on Friday afternoon and Sunday afternoon, and and summertime traffic going to Bend. Every city is struggling with it. Okay, now Development review. Let's get back into this for a little bit. Again, I covered part of it in the discussion of that one chart, but we'll try to go through it here. For the city of Oregon City, we made a distinction to try and make it easier for smaller developments to go through, in part because we were trying to make sure that we had an appropriate mechanism so that they analyzed the important things that would provide us with a lot of information for the city, but not be too burdensome on the developer, particularly on the small scale stuff. So we invented the transportation analysis letter. We've been using that since 2005. And then we have the different requirements when there's a zone change. Again, I mentioned that. When we have a zone change, we need to have an analysis that addresses the transportation planning rule. We've talked about that a little bit at certainly at the Planning Commission meetings. What's a reasonable worst case development scenario under the proposed zoning? And again, we have different requirements for master plans. For master plans, we require an analysis for each phase of the development. Transportation analysis letter, fewer than 24 peak hour trips or fewer than 250 daily trips. The focus is really right close to the proposed development. Focus on driveway and circulation, intersection spacing if that's coming up, sight distance at the driveways and any new intersections. We talked about safety, frontage improvements. Those are kind of the key things that they have to provide an analysis of. And in some cases, those of you on the Planning Commission have seen it, if someone is talking about a modest expansion of their existing, say, retail establishment, they say, we're not even going to expand our parking lot, we're going to use the same driveways. They just say that in the application. We still make them look, say, is there anything about that driveway that is peculiar? Is there, do they need to deal with some particular issues? What's been the safety history of that location?
John, can you go back a second?
Yeah.
Sorry. Based on what you and I were talking about just before we started with the number of trips, am I thinking right on this, that the break here would be about like 25 single-family houses?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And it would move to transportation impact study?
Yes.
Okay.
But then what happens if you have a 25 lots, 25 lots?
Well, that's why we have our transportation system plan. Because the transportation system plan, we talked about that, we're going to have about 8,000 new dwelling units over the next 20 years, about 300 a year, and we think we have analyzed on a citywide basis what the impacts of those 8,000 new dwelling units is going to be. Transportation impact study. It's similar to the transportation analysis letter, but it's for bigger developments. I mean, we do have to draw that line somewhere. But we add additional requirements once they get over that 25. They have to conduct traffic counts and perform an operational analysis of the driveway and the collector and collector or above intersections where there are 20 or more peak hour trips. And they must account for in-process development. That is, the subdivision that was approved last year, but hasn't been fully built out. So if we have a string of 5 subdivisions come in, some in the 10 or 15 range, and then the guy comes in with 40, he's got to account for those previous 5 in doing his analysis. Not perfect, but you do have to draw the line somewhere. They have to do a comparison with the performance standards that we have specified in the city code and the TSP. the volume to capacity ratio, the delay, and we have to have them perform analysis of the impact on queuing at traffic signals. And they have to analyze the mitigation options if any of the performance standards are not being met.
Question, John?
Yeah.
In association with that, you're placing the obligation on the developer.
Yes.
Okay, now, isn't some of the obligation and responsibility to be placed on the city? Because there's going to be collector streets involved in this, maybe on-site or off-site, to serve maybe a 50-acre, 100-acre development.
Well, we've tried to identify those in the TSP. We have hundreds of projects identified in the TSP. You know, whether it's South End Road being, you know, upgraded, you know, it's transitioning from a 2-lane, 20-foot wide asphalt road with no pavement, you know, no shoulders, to a full urban street section. Mm-hmm. That is identified and specified in our transportation system plan. And for a development that comes in adjacent to that or any of the other collectors, we require that they do the frontage improvements to match what is identified in the TSP. Now, in some cases, we give them some options, and they're welcome to analyze and try to make a case for adjustments, whether that's using a green street concept that uses swales instead of curbs, or curb-tight sidewalk because of terrain and things like that. But it is the developer obligation to perform the frontage, first of all, to perform the analysis, develop what the appropriate mitigation measures would be, and to implement the frontage improvements for any collector or street and above, and to implement the city streets, the local streets, according to city standards.
At what point does it become the city's obligation in any kind of a study, as a part of the recommendation, to start considering, like for instance, the extension of Holly Lane from Holcomb Road down to Redland? Now that's going to be a public obligation to construct that.
I don't think it will be a public obligation to
You think the
construct it.
developer will?
I mean, I think it's going to be it is where that road goes through a developer's property. I think it's going to be his obligation to build the road to serve the needs specified in the TSP, but the city will, the developer is only required to build the local street. Mm-hmm. The fact that it's being oversized will mean that the city provides credits against the SDC for the oversizing of the facility. That is what making it a collector instead of a local street.
Similar to what happened at Clackamas Community College with Myers?
Similar, yes.
I see the need out there being defined in a general sense. I don't see the specifics being, and details being accepted as by the city, as this is an obligation that we should participate in, not just the developer. And that's, as a citizen, as a taxpayer,
okay,
and as a planning commissioner, that's where I see a real need, that sooner or later, the city is going to have to do a little pushback, or they're going to have to say, hey, we're partners with this transportation.
We're definitely partners, because when that developer comes forward with his plan and does the analysis that says at the intersection of Holly Lane and Livesey, there are going to need to be, there's going to eventually.
And let's talk, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I appreciate the very specific questions, but because it's not adopted through by the city commission,
Okay.
maybe really just talking
Yep.
general statements.
Okay, I mean, let's take an example along Glen Oak Road. If we have at Glen Oak Road, and a developer comes in and he's required to analyze whether his development needs a left turn lane to provide access off of Glen Oak Road. If that developer comes in and we say, actually, it's true, you need to have a left turn lane, and the city will undoubtedly be a participant because it goes beyond the local road issue. It becomes a city obligation to participate for the oversizing of something. So, yeah, the city is involved, and the process is in place with the systems development charges to give credit. And in fact, I've got a slide coming up on that.
All right.
You talk about 20 or more peak hour trips being you go to the next intersection, it's 20. You go to the next one and it's 18. Do they just stop?
Yep, they dribble away.
But what if the dribbling, meets again at some point? For instance, pretty much anything happening at South End Road is going to have an impact on 10th and McLaughlin.
No, it's not, because some of those trips are going to the local shopping areas. They're going to the schools. They're going, and frankly, some of them are going, a few are going south to, Malala or Estacada.
Can be.
Right, but
They're going to work.
yeah, I mean, because of our geography, coming down off the hill, pretty much everything coming down off the hill at some point impacts McLaughlin and 10th Street. Because whether you went the other way down South End and got onto 99 and came north, whether you got onto 99 on Tumwater, whether you kept driving down Center or High Street, and got onto Washington and then dropped down the, I mean, it's everything, there's like 3 choke points. And I think the problem we've got is, well, the problem I have, and you may be able to, solve this problem, is that we stop looking and then the streams come back together again,
Well,
and we're not getting anything for that impact.
Well, I think there's less of that recombining than you're suggesting. Because I think there are any number of intermediate points where people are going to have their destinations. And we're going to see, I think we're going to have to see more of that. We showed the maps of the increase in employment in Oregon City. I mean, we are all going to have to think about using the destinations that are closer to home. And part of it is we're all going to be more willing to stay close to home because of the congestion that we encounter going further. And there are going to be more local choices in Oregon City than there are today. So, and part of that is the regional center concept.
Yeah, I guess the problem I have is there's your philosophical outlook on what will happen in the future. There's my philosophical outlook on what's happening in the future, and nobody's putting counters down to see what the reality of it is.
Well,
And it may be that mine trends, and then the industrial development builds, and then I go away, and it becomes your vision of the future. But I just think the problem is getting back to Bob, we're going to have to foot that bill to answer the question because it's outside the 28 trip limit, most likely, for any development in the near future. I mean, short of somebody developing something downtown.
Right.
So,
Well, we believe that using the regional model for the RTP and for the TSP, that we have accounted in Oregon City for that 8,000 new households and 8,600 new jobs in Oregon City. And that mix has been accounted for in the regional model that ends up producing about those numbers are in the range of 60% increase in both of those numbers. And we're looking at probably a 30 to 40% increase in traffic within the city. And the reason we're not looking at 50 or 60 is because that emphasis on alternative modes and the shorter trips and those various other factors. But that's why we came up with about 100 projects in the TSP, as well as increased public transit and the bicycle walking network and the family-friendly streets and all of those things. And it's why we are requiring developers to do things like requiring the Clackamas Community College to participate in Myers Road. And I've been involved with the city stuff long enough that, I mean, I saw the Glen Oak Road being built. Now we're going to see Myers. I mean, that's two examples of major, collector minor arterial streets being built across the south part of the city in direct response to development.
but
John,
where do they get off the hill?
I think,
Well,
what, I get it with your models and people leak off in all their different directions. But because of our geography, most places you do this, right?
yep,
Not, they don't
Here,
have that in Ontario.
We do that. We all end up in the same 4 streets downtown.
right. But then again, what's the market out, that was built out? I mean, we have new destinations in Oregon City. I mean, it used to be that you had to drive farther to get to the reasonable grocery stores. We've got some that we didn't have 20 years ago. I think we're going to see more of those. I mean, yes, for the people who must be, so our work trips account for about 20 or 25% of our daily activities, our daily trips. But
So
we have
that's-
an awful lot of them that are,
Is that the people leaving here to go
well,
elsewhere and the people
each of
coming
us-
in to go here?
each of us goes, to and from work. And then we have various other trips, whether it's the shopping trips or the visiting trip, various things. The work trips account for 20 or 25% of the regional trips. And we have less flexibility about where we go for those than we have for our other trips. We can substitute going to the close by store rather than the more distant one for our shopping trips. For the work trips, we're kind of stuck. But we have had more increase in the telecommuting. Most of us have a lot more flexibility in terms of the hours, flexible working arrangements that allow us to have different hours at our place of employment than we did, 30 and 40 years ago. We have to, because we cannot afford to build the roads to allow everyone to choose their own time, their own route for a free flow trip, we have to make other accommodations. So it's the mode of travel we take, the distance we take, the time of day. And again, I've got a couple of things I can show you about time of day if we get there.
John, quick question on the
John.
road financing. I think you said that a developer would pay for the residential portion, and then the city would pay for the oversizing. And as I was understanding it, the city would be using SDCs to pay for the oversizing.
Right.
So is there sufficient projection of SDC revenue to cover the projected city share for the oversizing on all these projects?
So, one thing is that, this is a good discussion, I like it. So the model does account for the pinch points, they don't all fall off the map. And then also, one thing to note about the TSP2 is that, we look ahead 30 years, I'm coming back to your question. We look ahead 30 years and then we do it and then we do it again. So normally you ought to be doing it every 10 years or so. So we make these projections. I'm sure I hope we're right on 100% of them, but if we're not, we'll come back in 10 years and adjust accordingly. And then in that model, in that regional model, we'll take a look to see how the intersections have changed and identify opportunities for improvement so they do meet our mobility targets. And if not, we're in big trouble. So your question is about SDC, about oversizing, and the answer is a little complicated, but some people oversize things, and if their oversizing is not on our CIP and not eligible for SDC reimbursement, you don't get it. So SDCs aren't guaranteed, you apply, and that goes through our Development Services Department, and the SDCs are met for increase in capacity, and so people do projects, and it includes a lot of times some maintenance-related things and some capacity-building things. The SDCs only apply to capacity-building things. It has to be on the list to get reimbursal. So there are a lot of projects that developers come across that they have to do because they are impacting it, and so they have a condition of approval in their land use to do an improvement, and they aren't going to get reimbursed for it. And they get reimbursed through SDCs, which is paid for by new development.
So an example I can think of is like the Westmoreland district around Reed College, where they have one-way streets separated by a planter divider with huge, mature trees, and it's basically park down the middle of the street. Because that is not what our plans are, if they wanted to build their subdivision that way, go for it, but they ain't gonna get a dollar from us for it. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that as long as they are complying with city street standards.
Yeah, that they have a sidewalk and that they have so many feet of paving and so many.
Right.
But if they wanna stick a park down between the in and the outbound lane, because they wanna plant elms or whatever, then great, do it, please.
Yeah.
But
Well, if they're going into a concept plan area and the street sizes are already figured in the concept plan, wouldn't they be responsible for the entire cost because they know going in it's a collector?
Oh, no, I don't.
So there's a test that we do when we review land use. When we condition things, there's two questions we have to ask based off case law, which are, is what they're doing, is there a nexus for what they're doing to what we're asking them to improve? So in the transportation realm, you'll see, are you impacting this intersection with more than X number of trips? Are you putting a certain number of cars through this intersection? If the answer is yes, then the next question is the improvement that we're asking proportional to what they're proposing? And so there's a proportionality test as well. So people will fix a portion of the improvement. So if the improvement is, let's make a really cheap improvement, say it's $100, which we know doesn't exist. If improvement is worth $100, but the developer is only putting in 10% of the trips through the intersection, then they would pay $10. So there's a proportionality test that has to occur. The other complicated part of that is in some of these concept plan areas, if you need the thing built sometimes in order to meet the mobility target. So you might not be able to move ahead until the thing is built, and that is not our problem.
But in that $100 instance, it's
No, I mean, it
possible
won't
for
get
the,
built. That's what I mean by not our problem.
but it's possible for the developer to spend the whole $100 and then say, and when people continue to build out in this area, I want my $90 back.
They can set up a reimbursal district, and that would do that.
The other thing that, it's hard to predict,
Vern, you're gonna have to sit a little
it's,
closer.
it's hard to predict how this will play out over the years, but as John's question was, when you have to pay part of your SDCs back for oversizing and that, don't you still have the possibility in increasing SDCs over the years? So it's not a thing that you just stuck with today's values. You can increase those small or as needed.
The problem with that is that SDCs don't cover the costs of
I
development.
know it
Yeah,
doesn't
I mean,
cover
I know you
the
know
total
that.
cost, but
So
you're not.
raising them isn't gonna, other goods gonna make the people who are trying to develop get really cranky, which is what they're already saying
But
right now.
You would rather have it do that than to just keep the city pouring SDC dollars back in that they don't have. It's
won't
a
be.
negotiation type thing, I think.
I think we've talked about this a little bit, conditions of approval for development is we have the frontage improvements, and then we have the off-site mitigation, the examples being installation of signals or a turn lane, or maybe paying a proportionate share for the city to come back and do a project later. Transportation systems development charges. Again, we've kind of talked about this for part of the last 10 minutes, that they're allowable under state law. There's a specific ordinance that was adopted by the city, goes through a detailed public process to adopt it. In Oregon City is based on the PM peak hour trip generation. And as Laura said, the SDCs may only be used for capacity enhancements, improvements, cannot be used to solve existing problems. So it is limited.
So if a developer drives his dump trucks back and forth across the road to get to his construction site, and that alligators or otherwise damages the road, we can't use SDCs to repair that road?
That's correct.
But Public Works would, if there's one project that did something that created an issue, then as a part of that project, they would likely make them address that.
We always
How?
get stuck with it. We've been
Well, I can't think of one project that's created alligators, but if something happened, if sometimes in construction projects, if they ruin a curb somewhere else, or there's some incident that happens, then they'll have to fix it.
But
Because we won't sign the
repairing a
plan.
pavement is not a capacity increase. So no, SDCs cannot be used for that.
Well, Damon raises a good point. Can't you change the ordinance to make that include that?
No, state
Why?
law,
It's the state
State
law.
law.
state law,
Is that right?
You know
absolutely.
what happened to home rule?
Huh?
Home rule.
I got it at my house,
Well,
home rule.
well, I know you do.
Your wife?
She's doing the ruling.
That's right. But she doesn't build the roads.
She told me to hit the road.
I understand that.
Okay,
That's a
well,
different topic.
enough of this frivolity.
Thanks.
Yep.
Frivolity.
Okay, to move to just a couple other things, Beaver Creek 213, a couple of you were participants in that process, but I thought I'd highlight, we've got a lot of good information about that, and I thought I wanted to share some of that with you here a little bit. It may be the most studied intersection in the region for, there's been a lot of good work done on that.
Still haven't fixed it, have we?
And this is just one of the tables, this is the summary table of travel time going through that intersection. They use some rather interesting technology stuff that has only recently become available. But this is showing two different things, the average time it takes to get through about a half a mile section. They analyzed it for each of the 12 movements you could make. That is, northbound turning left, going through, or turning right, and, same for all of the approaches. But what this is showing you is how the travel time varies. There are two lines on here. The blue is the average time. That is 50% of the cars will take more than this time, 50% will take less. But what you can see is that in the 6 to 7 a.m. period, it's above the 100 seconds of travel time. It dips a little bit during the middle of the day, and then it gets higher to the 115, 120 in the, pretty much the whole of the afternoon.
Did you say seconds?
Seconds.
Okay. That, I didn't see it say on the graph there what that was.
Travel time, paren S, is seconds.
Yes.
Oh, S is for seconds. Okay, thank you.
Okay. But then the red line is the 85th percentile. That is, 85% of the vehicles take this amount of time or less, 15% take, so 5 out of 6 people get through less time, and 1 out of 6 people takes even longer. But here it's a lot more pronounced. The variation is a lot more pronounced. So, and clearly during the afternoon, the 5 o'clock peak hour can be pretty bad. 1 out of 5 people takes a full 200 seconds to go that, that half a mile. So this is part of the kind of the intro into that idea that I suggested, is that if people can shift their travel time, now this is just one intersection, and they're traveling 3 miles in Oregon City, and the average commute trip in the region is more like 9 or 10 miles. So multiply this over the entire distance of their 10-mile trip, or for the poor people who end up going even further, multiply it again to a 20-mile trip, and you can see the advantage of moving your time of day for your travel. So this is the hour beginning at 8 o'clock at 213 Beaver Creek, where you can see a really nice diagram showing all the traffic flows. So you can see the narrow lines are really minor, from Beaver Creek Road to 213 going south. Look, only 41 vehicles during the entire hour. But here's the AM peak hour having that really high northbound flow on 213, over 1,100 vehicles. Now just think that here's the 10 o'clock hour. Maybe flip back and forth between these, and you can see, look at how dramatically the volumes changed when we moved 2 hours later. I mean, 10 o'clock in the morning is still a fairly busy time, but look at all the potential there is for, if you could shift your commute time by 2 hours, there's a lot less traffic out there on most of those movements. Here's the 4 o'clock hour in the afternoon. And I mean, those numbers are high, but in comparison to the 10 o'clock or the 8 o'clock, they're a lot different. And look at the flows are different too. Here we are at the 5 o'clock hour, not too bad. And the 7 o'clock hour. But part of this is to think about your own commute schedule, when you are working, that the morning, you're pretty much committed to, say, the getting to work at the 8 o'clock or the 8:30 or 9 o'clock or whatever your start time is. But during the afternoon period, there's more likelihood of spreading your time out, in part because you maybe have errands to run on the way home. So you don't end up going through 213 and Beaver Creek at the same time. Everybody's going through 213 Beaver Creek at the same time in the morning, but coming home in the afternoon, it's more spread out. So that's one of the reasons why we have a particular solution at 213 and Beaver Creek, was a morning-oriented solution of adding a right turn lane from Beaver Creek to 213 north.
John, when I approach that intersection, I'm more concerned about traffic safety.
Yep.
As I am traffic volume.
Yes.
Really, when you approach that thing, your head is on a swivel.
Yep.
Really, I'm telling you. And it just takes one, because
Sure.
of the potential for speed. Somebody racing a yellow light or something, or doing a screwy maneuver. So my concern, basically, rather than volume, is traffic, public safety.
Yep.
That's what I look at a highway for, is public safety. Maybe it's because I'm getting older and what have you, but these young drivers, they just don't seem to have any capacity for caution.
Right. Right. Well, we identified this intersection has long been a concern of particularly of ODOT, and it ranks on the SPIS list. Let's see, I've forgotten exactly what the acronym stands for, but it's a Safety Priority Index System, SPIS. It's one of the 10%, or maybe even 5% of the worst intersections on the state highway system in terms of the crash rate, the fatality rate, the severe injury. All of those tend to go up at signalized intersections and congested signalized intersections. We have projects identified in the TSP for a queue warning system. Part of that would be signs with lighting, flashing lights to indicate to the driver as they're approaching the intersection that there's stopped traffic ahead. And there are various mechanisms by which something like that can be implemented and controlled. Well, one of the concerns is the southbound traffic on Highway 213. They've come all the way from Redland Road without a signal. And it's a fast-moving road, and people are anxious, and they feel that, hey, they've made it out of the signal at Redland, and,
Exactly.
keep going. So if there's stopped traffic, the idea would be to warn those people. That helps some with rear-end crashes. Some of the evidence, though, suggests that the number of rear-end crashes is about the same on all four legs. So maybe the concern about the high-speed traffic from southbound is maybe misplaced, but it's a TSP project. And I would rather expect that if we end up moving forward with adding a right turn lane for that westbound to northbound maneuver, that there will be various safety factors that are implemented in connection with any construction project. There are also some ideas about changing the lane configurations to maybe make a little bit better use of the amount of pavement that's out there. I've got a couple other things we could talk about. Might be interesting. Speed zones is an example. A lot of people always have the question about, why can't the city just do, why can't we lower the speeds? Well, speed zones are prescribed by the state, Oregon revised statutes, established by administrative rule. And there's been a lot of concern about the fact that the speed zones are pretty much established with what's called the 85th percentile speed. You do actual speed surveys on the road and say that if 85, that you more or less are trusting the judgment of drivers under good conditions. The drivers feel that this is a safe operating speed. You use the 85th percentile speed, 85% go below the speed, 15% higher. That's usually about where you set the speed. Kind of the flaw with that is that I think that motorists take that as advice and certification that this is a safe speed. It is not. We rely upon, in Oregon, the basic speed rule that says you must choose a safe speed. I think the speed limit sign should be thought of as, this is the fastest we think you ought to be going under any circumstances. Daylight, dry conditions, not too much traffic. You change any one of those things, and I think the speed ought to be changing. There are some experiments going on, even in Portland, with variable speed limits. That's being done under new provisions of state law or experimental part, to have speeds that vary by time of day. So.
I gotta call a little bit of BS to that though, because all I have to do is look at Milwaukee. There is no way that 30 miles an hour would be the speed that people would go if it wasn't posted and patrolled at 30 miles an hour.
Right.
So they created a situation that made it 30 miles an hour, but it isn't. If they took that police officer out of there, there was no way, it would be a 45 in like
I agree.
3 minutes.
Yep.
So why doesn't the state post it at 45? I mean, they told us we couldn't make Lynn Avenue 20. It had to be 30
Yeah.
because that's what it could do.
We wanted it at 25.
Well, yeah, 25 and 35, whatever it is. But it was just like, they overruled us.
Well, that's right.
So
Well, state law. State law.
I know that's
and the
what get
OARs.
waved at us, but then when you point at all the exceptions to the state law, we're told we can't do it.
Right.
And then how did they do it?
Well, the simple answer to that is that the codes state that the base figure is based on the 85 percentile from ODOT, but the city itself can vary that plus or minus by 10 miles an hour. The city is not obligated completely to go by what ODOT says. Now, there is a certain amount of, danger involved in not complying with what the state comes up with.
I mean, the city of Portland has been battling about Burnside, West Burnside. You know, same thing. They came in with a recommendation for a 35 mile an hour limit instead of 40 or 45, and by a 3-2 vote, the speed advisory board turned them down, said they hadn't made the case.
Because the other thing I'd say about the 85% rule is then from 205 to Eugene, it should be about 95 on the highway. Because it's flat and straight. If that isn't a racetrack to go as fast as you can, I mean, it's almost an Autobahn.
Yeah.
And, you know, if it wasn't for the Salem Hills and the curve in Salem, it's.
Well, I'm mostly here to talk to you about the,
I know.
about the law, about law, not the,
I know,
not
but
the
it's just-
behaviors. So,
I think recently Portland changed and reduced the speed limit on Division and Stark east of 205.
Yep.
And then they have a small little posting electronically enforced. And that was a dramatic change because it came down. It was either 35 or 40 before.
Yep.
And so they were able to, I assume, buck the 85% rule. And instead of using an officer out there, they just have a camera.
well, and that was about a 5-year effort by the city to get permission and get the legislation through the state legislature to allow that to happen.
How did they get the residential zones reduced to 20 miles an hour?
They pushed hard for years and years. I am truly surprised that it happened, but I guess
After
that
they
finally finally a majority of the state legislature were willing to say, if Portland's silly enough that they want to do that, fine, as long as I don't have my constituents griping at me about it.
So it's only available for Portland?
Only for Portland.
Yeah, figures.
Another example, the Coburg on I-5. They put the cops out there. I mean, the former city manager, a personal friend of mine, and it said they would only enforce for vehicles who were traveling over 85 miles an hour. Only enforce on I-5 over 85 miles an hour. But a legislator in Eugene or Springfield introduced legislation that would try to keep the city of Coburg from getting any revenues from traffic fines. Because he got so many complaints from his constituents. So, it's not a...
Well, and the fact they raised over $1 million annually.
Yeah, it works for them.
That wasn't going to anybody else but Coburg, so.
Hey,
I say
does
more-
anybody think 85 miles an hour is a reasonable speed through an area that has an interchange? I don't. I mean, maybe between the interchanges on the Autobahn in Germany, but where there's merging traffic and stuff,
It's crazy.
so. Traffic signals, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, MUTCD, prescribes the warrants, their whole series of things you go through, the volumes, the warrants based on traffic volumes, on crash history. There are various ways you can show that a traffic signal is warranted. There are lots of different installations of signals. They can be fixed time or they can be actuated. There are some that are demand responsive. The traffic signals are actually reasonably sophisticated when you use an actuated system. If a car isn't there to make a left turn, occupying the left turn lane, you won't get the green arrow. It doesn't waste the time. It tries to make the system available. Those 60 seconds, it tries to make the maximum use of those. Timing is complex. You got minimums and maximums. You got to account for pedestrians. Pedestrian, if we figure the pedestrian is crossing at 3 or 4 feet per second, crossing a 50-foot wide road, that's, 12 seconds. But what if it's a diagonal road? What if the crosswalk is longer? It takes longer. And we have preemption for police and emergency vehicles. But you know what? That preemption will not cut down the pedestrian crossing time. If you've gone out there and pressed the button and gotten the walk to go across the 15 seconds, if it's a diagonal, a long crossing, and it's going to give you 15 seconds, hey, if that fire truck is coming from the side, he'll get the green light. But if you're out there, it's not supposed to cut you off. It'll stop him because you're the vulnerable person out there on the road. If you haven't pushed the button, if you just said, hey, it's a green ball for the cars, I'm going to go across, hey, that preemption might cut it off after 4 seconds. It'll immediately go to yellow, give the motorist the time to get across. But if you're out there jaywalking without the walking man, hey, it's not going to give you the time.
All bets are off.
Yep.
Then Darwin comes to visit.
Darwin?
Right.
Yes.
Crosswalks. Under Oregon law, there are marked and unmarked crosswalks. Every intersection between the corners is a crosswalk, unless there's a sign up that says crosswalk closed and the action has formally been taken to close it. A marked crosswalk is not necessarily safer. A lot of studies show it's the number of lanes and the volume of traffic. But anyway, Hey, I've run out of slides.
If you go back to, well, you don't need to go back, but going back to traffic signals, a couple of weeks ago, remember we talked about the split phase
Yes.
thing and the concept of, and just for the traffic advisory people, a neighbor of mine gave me a letter to give to you guys, and I gave it to the staff person, asking that 15th and Washington be looked at so that the people on 15th, because it's one lane and there's all this conflict about who's turning, that they be one at a time. So the downhill lane would go for 30 seconds, and then they would get a red, and then the uphill lane would go for 30 seconds. So that there wouldn't be any confusion about, well, I'm turning no, but I'm going straight, but I'm gonna turn. That the idea would be that would speed it up. And I mentioned that to John, and his concern is, but that would actually extend the overall time of the intersection. So at some point, hopefully you'll get that letter and you'll
We
have
got
a
it.
discussion about it. Okay.
It's quite a complicated system that she went through,
Yeah.
but it's being looked at.
Yeah, as somebody who drives that every day, but how much, as a general rule, how much time does each direction get?
Well, there is no general rule.
Right.
And in fact, I think that the state of Oregon prescribes that the cycle length is what it takes to go from completely around and serving all the different movements. Cycle length we like to keep as short as possible because that reduces the overall delay for most people. And it also keeps the queues short. So short cycle length is good for those reasons. However, each time the yellow comes up, a yellow follows every movement. Each time the yellow comes up, that's 4 seconds, usually about 4 seconds, when no one is moving.
Theoretically.
So if you have a simple two-phase signal, say north and south go, east and west go, if each of those is 26 seconds with a 4-second yellow, there you are for 1 minute cycle length, and you have used 8 seconds, 13% of the time, nobody is going. So if you change that to a 2-minute cycle length, each of them gets 56 seconds and 4 seconds. There, you've reduced it now that you've only got 6% of your time in the 2-minute period is with all traffic stopped. So you've actually improved your volume to capacity ratio, but you have, because you're using now 96% of the time to move cars through rather than 88% of the time, but you have increased your queues and you've increased the delay. Because if you get there at the end of the cycle, now you've got to wait.
A minute and a half.
You got to wait at least a minute before you get. But with the old system, with the 1 minute cycle, you only had to wait 30 seconds. But if we've got so many people, so many cars accumulating at the intersection, that the 26 seconds is not enough to get everybody through, that means you're stacking up, so you want to try to lengthen the cycle length. So that's why we have actually a fairly simple computer, and that controller box there on the corner will have certain parameters set in. Maybe at night, the default setting is to try and keep it down in the 40-second range. During the midday, maybe we're saying we could go to 80 seconds, and during the peak hours, we will allow it to go to a maximum of 120 seconds before it cuts people off. And it's trying to distribute the time appropriately throughout all of the movements. we concern ourselves with the through movements and the left turn movements for each direction of travel. So that's 8. Right turns we sort of don't care about. First of all, you got the right turn on red, and they can go when the through traffic is moving. If we go back to to one of these examples, you can see which ones are the conflicting movements. The left turns conflict with the oncoming through movements, but the north-south and north-south through movements do not interfere with each other, but they each interfere with the opposite left turn movement. Does this have I guess this doesn't have a pointer, or does it? Nope. Oh, that was a bad choice. Okay. Anyway, you know, with the controllers, we try to take advantage. So that, yeah, there's one of the conflict points. So a lot of times we can use up to an 8-phase signal, so that we can give each movement its separate ones. The issue that Damon brings up is a place where we don't have separate lanes. So the split, we would call it a split phase signal, where we would allow northbound to go, we'd allow southbound to go separately, and then we'd allow both east and west at the same time. So that would end up being a 3-phase signal. If we have northbound and southbound operating for through movements, and then maybe we have northbound left and southbound left, that would be a 2nd phase. We do the same thing on the eastbound and westbound through movements and left turns. That's a 4-phase signal. We allow longer total cycle lengths the more phases we have. But it's a balancing act. We still have only that 60 seconds to distribute. Or we can go to a 90 seconds or 120. I think the highest used in the state of Oregon is I think we've got 150 second, maybe 180 seconds now, someplace.
What would that be?
I have no idea.
A quick question, and I guess I've heard rumors to the fact that if you did improve this intersection and had grade separation and made it more efficient, the bottleneck would just move up to Malala and Myers Road, so.
To a certain extent, that's probably true.
If you get turned enough on Beaver Creek, I suppose that would be an improvement, but.
Well, the other thing one of the things we talked about at those committee meetings is maybe a couple of those movements could be eliminated. You know, that in this particular case, that westbound to southbound movement, only 45 vehicles. Boy, you know, that's less than one. That's, you know, less than one a minute.
Yeah.
You know, could we essentially say, well, those people are going to end up having to use Myers Road? If we cut that out, we can save that 4 seconds of yellow time.
Yeah.
Even if there's, you know, no other movement. But then again, on the other side, we can run those 45 vehicles at the same time we're running the 465, making that other left turn.
Mm-hmm.
So that's maybe not too important.
You had mentioned to me when you and I were chatting the other day that there's now a standard somewhere that deals with the cumulative effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the cumulative effects are analyzed in the RTP and the TSP. And that's how we've analyzed using the regional model and then using it with the transportation system plan. we've analyzed the impact of those 8,000 new dwelling units and 8,600 new jobs that are expected to be here in 2035. So yes, that has been analyzed.
Well, I'm talking about it on a micro scale.
Well, on a micro scale, we do require, when a development comes through for a transportation impact study, like for a 30 or 40 unit subdivision, that they have to account for the in-process development. So we are getting that more detailed analysis, not for every project that comes through, but for some of the larger ones, we put the obligation on them to analyze a certain number of those intersections, accounting for the development that has gone before, but is not yet in place.
Because I think what we had concerns about was, for instance, until the roundabout gets built, which, you know, I don't know if it'll be in our lifetimes, but we've got Leland, Warner Milne, Warner Parrott, and Lynn, and we've got a lot of developments out there coming in off of Central Point, coming into that nexus. You've got the intersections at Malala and Warner Milne. Then as it filters down, all of those intersections beyond those developments are having impacts. And that impacts not only the amount of congestion that people are expected to absorb, it affects the pedestrian environment because there's a lot more cars whizzing by, which makes it, you know, not pleasant. Mm-hmm. It affects the livability, mm-hmm. and it affects, you know, again, 10th and Main. What happens when they get down there? You know, exactly what you were talking about. It's like a little domino that keeps going, but we don't get to look at that, or we don't get to understand how this triggers this, triggers this, triggers that. Because
well, I mean, what I can tell you is that, you know, we have projects in the TSP at 14th and Main. We have, you know, that has been identified. Part of the cumulative effect of adding 8,000 dwelling units and 8,000 jobs is identifying a number of projects in the vicinity, including 14th and Main is one, to have a TSP project. And if I remember correctly, the price tag on a couple of those projects down there is pushing $1 million. And it's enlisted in the SDC project list. Now, as to when it's going to happen, I don't know. I think it was a shorter or medium-term project as identified in the TSP. We have put the condition of approval on a couple of these recent projects, including the Park Place Master Plan, to participate in a proportional share in proportion to the amount of traffic that they're adding to the predicted 2035 volumes. It will be a city obligation to design and undertake a project, but some of the money is starting to come through because of SDCs, because it's on the SDC list, and because of the proportional share obligation that we're putting on some of the developments that have a measurable impact on some of those intersections.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, you know, that's the aha moment coming up, because it's, you know, when is it going to happen?
Yep.
You know, later. So let me ask these fellows, it is past 9 o'clock, and what is your pleasure? Do you want to continue asking questions? Do you want to wrap it up and adjourn?
I've already got 2 texts from the family saying, why am I not home? They're hungry, so.
Oh, okay. We don't want hangry people. Down at your end, Mr. Mahoney?
Just got one question.
No, I was asking you, do you want to ask more questions, or do you want to
He wants to ask his
continue?
question.
I know you want to ask a question. I'm waiting for the consensus of the group. And I hear nothing, so please.
I'd say wrap it up.
Okay. John?
Yes, wrap it up.
Vern?
I don't care, neutral.
Okay. You got hangry people. Tom?
I've learned to keep my mouth shut.
Bob has a question.
Wrap it up.
Wrap it up? What about you, Mr. Mike?
Fine with wrapping it up.
Okay, all right. So I think we have a wrap.
But you haven't wrapped, so it isn't a wrap till you wrap.
Yeah, don't forget to wrap.
All right. Do you want any communications?
Sure.
2 seconds, Rick?
Yeah.
Just a heads up, thank you for everyone who participated in our equitable housing project to identify opportunities for additional housing around the city and also removal of barriers and some incentives. You will be getting a little postcard in the mail from us in the next couple of weeks. We're working on that language to make sure it meets legal standards, yet is understandable, as opposed to some in the past. And we will look forward to planning commission work sessions through the whole month of July to go over each one of those standards. We'll have an open house also at the end of July before we start going through the hearings process. So just a heads up, that's coming down the line.
Thank you.
John, thank you so much. We
Hey.
really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Gentlemen,
Very helpful.
thank you
Okay.
for attending.